Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will learn how to deploy our WordPress files from a Git repository up onto a web host. In our previous lesson, we learned how to move a database. Now in this lesson, we are focusing on files. However, before we actually move any files to our web host, I first want to cover a topic that is related to both files and the database. And that is that when you are manually moving a WordPress website, you need to account for the fact that the database that lives on your local dev environment and the database that lives on your web host require different login credentials in order for WordPress to be able to access them. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think the best way to understand the issue that I'm trying to describe is to open up the config file for our local dev environment WordPress. So right now, let me show you where you can find that file. On my computer, on my desktop, I have local sites, and then I have Fictional University, and then I have the app folder. And then within this folder that contains WP content, WP admin, and WP includes, there is a file named wp-config.php. So right now, let's go ahead and view this file in our text editor. And we actually opened this file back at the very beginning of this course. You might remember that we entered the name of a database username, and a database user password. Now, these values make sense and work within the context of our local dev environment, right? So if you're using my VirtualBox and Vagrant setup, these are the perfect values that will connect to the database. If you're using MAMP or WAMP or XAMPP or something else, you might have slightly different values. But the idea is that the database that lives on our web host account, it requires completely different values. Now at first you might think, big deal, who cares? Why don't we just update these values to whatever our web host database requires? Well, it's not that simple, because if we make any change to these values whatsoever, so if I change the database name to just something random and save that, well, now as soon as I visit my local dev environment website and refresh, it's completely broken, right? Because now it cannot establish a connection to its database. Let me put that value back really quick. Okay, so the question becomes, how can we set up this config file to please both our local dev environment and our web hosting environment? Well, there are probably 100 different ways to do that, but let me show you my favorite way. So right above this comment that says the name of the database for WordPress, right above that line, let's create an if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets, and actually right after the closing curly bracket, let's say else. Okay, and then for our condition check within these parentheses, let's say if file underscore exists, which is a function, so it gets its own set of parentheses. And as you might have guessed by the function name, we can use this to check to see if a certain file exists or not. So check this out. Within our app folder, right, that's the folder that contains WP content, WP admin. Within that folder, let's create a brand new file. Now the name of this file does not matter, but I'm going to name it local.php. Okay, now back in our config file, let's say that if a file named local.php exists in this folder, then we can set these values to make sense for our local environment. But if that file does not exist, then we can define these values to use whatever our web host needs them to be. Okay, and then when it comes time to push or deploy all of our files up onto the web host, we can simply just not push local.php onto the server. So that way, both of our environments, local and live, will be happy. So let's finish this condition check. Let's say if file exists, within those parentheses, let's say dir name, which is a function, so new parentheses. Within those parentheses, let's say underscore underscore file, all capitals, and then two more underscores. And then right after this one parenthesis, we can say dot to add on something else. So then a pair of single quotes, and a slash to look within the current folder, and then we just say local.php or whatever you named that new file. Okay, so if that evaluates to true, right here we can set these properties for our local database. If it evaluates to false, right here we can set these to match our live web hosting database. Just to clean up this code a little bit, I'm going to delete these extra comments. So I'm going to delete this name of the database comment, and the database username comment, and the password comment, and the host name comment. Cool. So now I've got these compact 4 lines of code. I'm going to cut these 4 lines of code into this if statement, and then I will paste another copy within the else. And just for you and I to stay organized, maybe right before this define, we could say a comment, local database settings, and then down in the else block, right before this first define, maybe a comment, live database settings. Now, in just a moment, we can learn what values we should actually use to connect to our web host database. But for now, let's set the database name to something completely random that we know would not work within our local dev environment. So if I go ahead and save this file, I can still refresh my website without any problem. And that's because this if statement is evaluating to true. So it's using these values. But if I go ahead and delete or rename that local.php file, so just really quick, if I rename it to x.php, well, now if I try to refresh the website, cool. So our if statement is evaluating to false and is trying to use the values that would make sense for our web hosting database. Perfect. So let me rename that file back to local.php, and we can just be sure to not push this file up onto the web host. Cool. Now let's go ahead and find out what values we should actually use in order to connect to our web host database. Now it's important to point out that every web hosting company is slightly different. So you might need to look for your hosting company's frequently asked questions page, or see if they have any documentation on setting up a database, or even get in touch with customer support. But the point that I'm trying to drive home is that I can't guarantee what values you should use here, because every host is different. But if you are using SiteGround, or if you're using a hosting company that uses cPanel, then odds are you can follow along with me step by step right now. So back in your hosting account cPanel, within this main area, let's scroll down to find the databases section and click on the MySQL database icon. Okay, so this is the name of the database. So I'm just going to copy that into my clipboard. And then back in my text editor, for the live settings, I will set the database name and just paste it in. Okay, now what about the username and password? Well, back in cPanel, if you scroll down to the bottom, here we see users. So this would be your username. Your name will be slightly different from mine, but go ahead and copy your name. Back in our text editor, paste it in for DB user. Okay, and then next, let's focus on the password. As far as I'm aware, there's no easy way of finding out your current password. So our best bet here is to probably just set a new password. So I will click on Set Password. Go ahead and make up whatever password you want to use, and then click Change Password. Cool, we see a success message. Okay, so then back in your text editor, just update the password here to whatever you set. And for SiteGround, we can go ahead and leave the host set to localhost. This is a common setting that will work with a lot of web hosts, but not all web hosts. So for this property especially, you will need to check your hosting documentation and maybe even reach out to customer support if necessary. Okay, let's go ahead and save this file. And now our database setup is complete. This code is able to successfully connect to our local database as well as our live database. Now, before we bring this part of the lesson to a close, there is one more miscellaneous topic that has nothing to do with deploying a website and is really just a quick security tip. So within this config file, if you scroll down a bit, you will see this area named Authentication Unique Keys and Salts. Now on these lines of code here, where we see put your unique phrase here, you can improve the security of your website and make it harder for hackers who are trying to imitate some of your users or steal a cookie or a session. Basically just make it all around more difficult on malicious users by inserting random phrases here. Now you don't have to think of the random phrases yourself. You can visit this URL that you see right here. So just copy this URL into your clipboard. Mine's awkwardly breaking onto a separate line, but the URL ends in salt /. Copy that into your clipboard, in a new tab, paste it in. Cool, and each time you visit this page and refresh, it's going to give you new randomly generated phrases. So just copy all of these lines into your clipboard, back in our text editor. You can delete these existing 8 lines, and then just paste in your clipboard. Mine looks awkward because my font size is too large to fit on a single line, but otherwise it would look something like that. So if you go ahead and save that, it is going to force you to re-log in to your local dev environment. It's going to kick out all current user sessions. So if I refresh, you can see I'd have to log in again. But you can log right back in, everything's back to normal, and now our website is a bit more secure. Now that's going to bring this part of the lesson to a close. In the next part, we will get to the moment we've all been waiting for. We will implement deployments that automatically happen every time you update your GitHub or Bitbucket repository. It's a super luxurious workflow that makes future updates to your code files a piece of cake. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then.